Okay, we're back. We're live. This is Think Tech Talks here on a given Monday at 1 o'clock. And we're going to do energy, so let's call it Hawaii, the state of clean energy. What can we expect in solar in 2014? With Marco Mangelsdorf, Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii, joins us by telephone. Hi, Marco.
Hello, Jay. Great to be back with you again.
Great to have you on the phone. Great to have you on the show. Anyway, I just wanted to touch base with you, and I got some stuff from you, charts and graphs and whatnot, and I guess this is for 2012 and 2013 on the trends in solar, and it follows stuff we've seen in many places, that solar is on the decline. So can you give us a snapshot about how 2013 ended in terms of the decline of installations in solar in the state?
Sure, Jay. Interestingly, there was something of a disconnect between the islands, which I was rather surprised to see that I don't have the data yet for Maui County, but the Big Island at least showed a steady increase in the fourth quarter of last year as far as PV permits issued, whereas the data for the permits on Oahu from the Department of Permitting and Planning, City and County of Honolulu, showed that the final months of last year, just kind of continued the 8-month straight decline of permits being issued, PV permits being issued in the last 8 months of 2013 compared to those same months in 2012. So overall number of PV systems that were permitted across Oahu were roughly about 20% fewer than 2012. That said, we're also seeing kind of a countervailing trend of the fact that there were a lot of PV systems that were sold the last handful of months in 2012 that spiked up the overall permit numbers for 2012. However, those PV systems were not installed until the first month of 2013, so there was a bit of a lag between the permit data, which you would expect, and actual systems going online and being inspected and approved by the appropriate utility. So
you're tracking on the permits, though, right?
That is correct, and eco companies and Kauai Island Utility Co-op, KIUC, should be providing the net energy metering numbers for 2013 to the PUC pretty much any day now, which will be the actual numbers of those systems which went online and started to produce power and feeding into the grid, not only net energy metering systems, but also feed-in tariff systems and what are called standard interconnect agreements, as well as utility scale systems that went online. So those numbers will be coming from the utilities filed with the PUC, pretty much any day now, I expect.
Oh, okay. Well, what are the reasons now for this? It's a substantial decline. The reason for the decline. I mean, we talked about this before, and my recollection is that part of it is that the people are a little nervous about the what I call legislative and tax credit environment. Part of it is that it's just sort of saturation for some places. Part of it is the HECO. HECO reluctance to issue, to connect. And so those three things I can remember we talked about before, but is there any particular, vector or reason that has emerged as, the dominant one for this 20% decline?
I think it's a combination of those factors that you just mentioned, and again, a countervailing trend along with the decline in the number of PV permits issued is the greater success that a small minority of companies have had as far as increasing their numbers from 2012 to 2013. If you look at the top 15 players in 2012 compared to their performance as far as pulling permits, at least PV permits, and the stated value of the project on the permit itself, if you look at the top 15 from 2012 compared to how they did in 2013, only 3 of the 15 showed an increase year to year, whereas 12 of the 15 went down. And those 2 of the 3 that actually showed increased numbers, which include Vivint Solar and Solar City, both based on the mainland, their principal model in terms of making sales is through the third-party ownership option, where essentially the homeowner has the option of not paying anything out of pocket for a PV system to go on their roof, and they're agreeing to pay for the power produced over time, the solar power produced over time at a rate that's most likely going to be below what they're paying HECO. So those 2 companies, those 2 nationwide companies, saw their numbers go up on Oahu in 2013 compared to 2012, and that to me it indicates that the third-party ownership model or option is still quite popular, has grown in popularity, and appears to not have peaked in terms of the demand for that type of acquisition option. Whereas if you look at similar data for this third-party ownership option on the mainland and the principal mainland markets, places like Arizona, California, New York, the numbers over the past several years show that that option is peaking, but I don't believe that we've seen that peak yet in our state. So the option of being able to get solar when you want it without having to pay anything out of pocket, or at least the option of a lot less out of pocket, is still very, very attractive.
Yeah, it's a financing deal. And you know, I mean, I got to tell you a story, if I may. We're walking in my neighborhood, which I do pretty frequently, and there's a truck there, and it's a solar company, and they're installing on some guy's roof. So I engaged with the boss of that company, and he was I must say that he was a very strong personality. He was a local guy, real good salesman, and he had an answer to every question, and I wasn't asking him easy questions. And I said to myself, gee, this is almost like an irresistible pitch. But it's even more irresistible and he said that he did this, that he could finance the whole thing, and I wouldn't have to pay anything up front. Just let him on the roof, and he will make it happen, and my bills will go flat and down. And you know, and I will have the benefit of I will have the joy of knowing that I have solar on my roof, and I'll be able to hedge against increasing oil. I mean, it's an irresistible pitch, and so I can imagine these nationals who have really polished that pitch. They go around and talk to people. It's just hard to say no. It doesn't cost you anything. It's amazing.
Well, in fact, that has been part of the Vivint solar model, which has relied upon a door-to-door sales approach by probably typically fairly young folks who are carrying with them a contract that can be filled out probably within minutes, and that contract is one page. It's two-sided, one page with, of course, what you might expect, a lot of very fine print lawyer language. But honestly, I've been rather astounded that this company, which has been in our market now for just a little under 2 years, they first hit our shores March of 2012, so we're coming up on about 2 years in a couple months, that they've been able to be as wildly successful as they have in terms of rising to the top of the heap in 2013 as far as the highest number, the greatest number of PV permits pulled, and they rely on door-to-door sales and a boom type of two-page sales contract that is convincing enough to get apparently a lot of people decide sign right then and there, right on the spot.
Well, everybody talks about low-hanging fruit, you know, in the sense that the solar industry, in fact, the energy industry in general, has taken all the low-hanging fruit, and now we're into the more, you know, the next stage where it's not low-hanging anymore, and you got to work a little more to get it. And so people who were inclined to just plunk down $30,000, $40,000 and do this, you know, without financing, just put it on the roof, you know, take the tax credit and all that, and getting the tax credit, that's part of their deal. You know, they've already done it, and now we're into the next tier, and it's the guys who don't have the money necessarily or don't want to spend the money. The tax credit doesn't mean that much to them because they don't have the money. And
Right.
and so now somebody has to make it possible for them to do it, like the other guys, like the first wave. And these guys, Vivint and otherwise, they come around and they make it possible. So it's not low-hanging fruit anymore. It's the second phase, but it works really swell because these are the guys who want to do what the first wave did but can't for some reason. And now they have their big chance and they're all too happy to sign a 2-page contract. That's what's happening, though.
Right, and it's not just Vivint, of course. It's also Solar City, which is just they went public last year, and this is a company which has yet to make a declared profit since they've been around for the past approximate 6 or 7 years now, if I'm not mistaken. And yet they are apparently a darling of Wall Street and investors, and they have a market capitalization of just a hair under $5 billion. So there is an extraordinary buzz with some of these companies in terms of investors that's led to really wild numbers out there in terms of stock pricing. And Solar City, Vivint, and there's also a company called Sunrun, which is also based in the Bay Area, that is very visible and very active in our market. And Clean Power Finance is another company that deals with residential lease and power purchase agreements, and they're active in our market. And then there's also SunPower Corporation. So it's, I guess, not surprising that we've attracted the attention of so many of the heavyweights on the mainland and investor money that want to go after our market.
Well, I think it's like a snowball. It's a strange metaphor, but it's like, the more it's a peer group thing. If my neighbor has it, I have to have it too. If my neighbor could afford it and I couldn't afford it, well, now my big chance has come. But there's more here, and that is, the question is, how much more have we got in the second wave?
Right.
Marco, is the second wave bigger than the first wave? Is this financing arrangement that's come up, is this going to carry us for thousands? Right now, what are there, 36,000 installations? Is it going to carry us for another 36,000 or more or less? What do you think?
Well, when all is said and done, once I think further data is in showing what went in 2013, it's probably reasonable to assume that we're pushing well over that number you just cited, and could very well push Hawaii to the very top in terms of PV systems installed per capita. I think right now we're number 2, if I'm not mistaken, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if when the data came out that it shows that Hawaii is both number 1 in solar water heating per capita, as we've been for quite a while, and number 1 in solar PV. So what's to come in 2014 in terms of how much of the we've gone through the early adopter phase, and we're now into the bulk of the consumer market. So how many more consumers are willing and able and wanting to dive into or get on the PV train that they see bopping along as their neighbors do it and their relatives do it? And I think the number one constraint right now is are grid issues, grid saturation issues, and just how much further the 4 utility companies here in the state can go beyond just essentially what I think of as working at the margins and increasing nominal capacity by adding a grounding transformer here or a bank of batteries there, or some type of different calculations that allows them to squeeze a little bit more into the grid. And that's the big question. That's the big challenge, I think, as a state, and people in my business are waiting to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in the second part of our discussion. But before we go to the second part, I wanted to ask you one more question. In 2014, presumably, I think it was supposed to be this month, but things never actually roll out on time. On-bill financing supposed to be there. And in that way, after 3 years of preparation and perseveration, we now presumably have on-bill financing ready to go. And that means that you can buy your PV system through a billing system that reveals itself on your electric bill. Makes it even easier. You just pay the electric bill, which is sort of a combination of the financing arrangement for a PV system plus the connect fee, whatever that is. But my question to you, Marco, is that the same thing as these nationals of Solar City and Vivint? Or is that different? I mean, how does that change the way things work when we get on-bill financing going for these PV installations? Will it be better?
Well, I have to show my ignorance here, Jay, in that I don't know exactly the mechanics or the specifics of how something such as on-bill financing would actually play out in Hawaii. And my impression is that we're still months and months away from that actually rolling out, unless I'm missing something here in terms of how the actual mechanics would work in that kind of program, because I don't believe you'd have HECO doing installing PV systems, maintaining and installing PV systems, that you'd still have private contractors like mine.
No, it would still be a private contractor, and it would be financed by somebody who's sort of behind the scenes on this, and then the payments on the financing arrangement are made through your electric bill. But somebody is going to package that for you behind the scenes, and all you need to do is, again, sign on the line, maybe another 2-page, agreement from one of the same installers. It's just that it gets financed through the, I don't know how it's going to work either. I'm not sure a lot of people do know how it's going to work. I'm just wondering how much it's going to change things, if any. It may be just a question of what comes in the mail and how many checks you write.
Well, and the principle sounds to me to be the same, is that there's little to nothing out of pocket for the homeowner, that the homeowner gets to have a PV system on his or her roof, and that they are paying for it over time, whether it's through a charge on their HECO, HELCO, MECO, or KIUC bill, or whether they're sending a check every month or every quarter to Vivint or Solar City or Sunrun. I mean, the principle is the same. So I don't believe that on-bill financing, once it finally rolls out, will provide any type of tangible benefit or will be all that better than what homeowners can take advantage of now.
Yeah, it's so interesting how, technology and just a fickle finger sometimes, makes a long-standing plan irrelevant, and things eclipse what you thought was going to happen, and now you're in another world. I think in a certain sense, solar has done that to other types of renewables. Anyway, this is Marco Mangelsdorf from Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii. You're listening to Think Tech Talks, and we're talking today, Monday, about the state of clean energy in Hawaii and what can we expect in solar in 2014. I'm Jay Fidell. We'll be right back after the short break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Okay, we're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell here on Think Tech Talks. We're talking about Hawaii, the state of clean energy, and what can we expect in solar in 2014 with Marco Mangelsdorf of Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii. So, Marco, you mentioned, you alluded before to this whole issue about interconnect. Can you give us a status report on how that's doing? I mean, it seems like it's a moving target. There's controversy, there's complaint, there's response, and it's hard to figure out exactly where we are and whether there's relief immediately or soon.
Sure. Well, let me give you what I kind of consider my Grid Fundamentals 101 primer, and it goes something like this. The grid, any electric grid, is by definition finite, which is really to state the obvious, because to argue otherwise would be to argue that the grid is infinite, which is, of course, not true and not possible. So we've got a finite grid. That's a given. if we've got a finite grid, that means we have a finite amount of power feeding into any given grid, because it would make sense to have an infinite amount of power feeding into a finite grid. So that's kind of fundamental number two. So we got a finite grid, we have a finite amount of power feeding into the grid. Therefore, it brings up the big question, which is what should be the best mix, the proper mix, the most advantageous mix, the most economic mix of power sources feeding into the grid. And in this particular situation with our independent island grids, there are a number of different sources of grid power. Most of it is from the combustion of fuel, whether it's waste, like you have there on Oahu for so-called H-power, or whether it's bunker oil, or whether it's diesel. It causes a turbine to spin around and around, creates an electric field, and produces electricity that's carried off with wires, big cables going far and wide, delivering power to where power is needed. So the challenge has been, well, just how much renewable energy can feed into a finite grid. And with these ambitious 70% by 2020, 40% renewable energy, 30% energy efficiency, just within 6 years from now, which is pretty daunting when you think about it. How can more renewable energy be brought online and yet not jeopardize the grid's ability to handle it and provide safe, reliable power where when people need power, they're going to have it? I mean, from what I understand, Molokai, for example, has been suffering through a rather intensified period of power outages. To what extent that's due to that the high solar saturation there at times, or the fact that the grid is rather limited and vulnerable to a tree falling on a power line that goes from Kaunakakai toward the east of the island, and there's only one power line. I don't have all those answers, but we all agree, I believe, that it's a very, very good thing and a very desirable thing and a very necessary thing to have a grid that's going to be as close to 100% reliable as possible. Okay, so I think so far from what I've said, there's little disagreement. Now, the disagreement is coming about when it comes to the utility saying, well, we've reached a point in this particular circuit and that circuit and a growing number of circuits where we've reached a threshold of solar capacity in that circuit that we have to be more cautious and more thoughtful and more analytical about how much more we can accommodate before we have to draw some more firm red lines.
And how do we know? How do we know when we reach that point?
Well, again, I will be the first to say I'm not a utility engineer. I'm not an electrical engineer, so I have to essentially beg off on questions like that to people who know more than I do. But it is just from a relatively informed layman's perspective, when you've got so-called non-firm power or power sources such as wind and solar that can be unpredictable. And then with solar, for example, if you've got, let's say, a 5 megawatt or 10 megawatt or even larger utility scale photovoltaic project, you can go from 100% output at 1 p.m. to 40, 50% or less within minutes. Why? Clouds come over. So that gives the utility a real challenge in terms of needing to ramp up and ramp down their own generators to try to match that up and down nature of solar. Now, you can definitely mitigate against that by having battery banks, as first wind did up in the Kahuku area, or giant capacitor banks that to smooth that output out from a variable power source. But it still represents a challenge that just doesn't lend itself to quick and easy fixes so far. So,
yeah, let me tell you a wild guess about what happened on Molokai. I mean, I remember reading, the first piece of news that came out was that Hawaiian Electric, or Maui Electric, was going to install some substantial battery. I think it was a 3 megawatt battery in Molokai,
correct.
And that's quite something. Because, right now, Molokai is sort of the least advanced grid in the state, I think. And they got, what they got, just like Lanai, they got these post-World War II banks of diesel generators sitting in a field. And that's their main system. Well, there are some, real environmentalists and clean energy people in Molokai that are passionate about installing PV. I mean, you don't think of it in those terms because they were so difficult about the wind project, but they do that. They install a lot of PV, and it helps to save on what might otherwise be, really expensive electricity with those banks of diesels. Okay, so now you got the PV on top of the diesels, and the PV, as you said, is very sensitive to even small changes in cloud cover. And so the diesel setup is old. It's an old grid. It's not a smart grid. And presto, you get brownouts because of the new PV. Once you start relying on it, and find that it's not quite reliable, then you got a problem. And I think that's why Maui Electric decided to put this battery in, because they were already having that problem. No sooner does the Maui battery get publicized, then the fact that they're having brownouts, that gets publicized. So the battery in Molokai is becoming all the more important every day. And there you go with an independent grid. So I want to take that digression just to give you my thoughts on the logic of it.
Well, just if I might add to that, Jay, the very interesting proposal that's come out of that company in California that is known as the Princeton Energy Group, which Peter Tabor, I believe, is one of the principals there, and he got some publicity a couple, 3 weeks ago for his proposal that his company develop and build a 17 megawatt PV array in what's known as Manila Camp, right outside of bustling downtown Kaunakakai, and that would be used in conjunction with a pumped hydro system. Pumped hydro, just very briefly, is when you are using renewable energy, in this case solar, that's obviously you're generating the energy during daylight hours, and you're using that power, or some of that power, to take water and pump it uphill to a reservoir, and then allowing the water to come back down and spin it through hydro turbines when the sun's not shining, and therefore essentially create a 24-hour-a-day more dependable, more reliable renewable energy system that you would have other than just relying on solar. So Tabor has proposed this to MECO, and MECO's being rather closed-mouthed about it, and understandably, as they're having preliminary discussions with yet again another enterprising, ambitious developer on the mainland who has peachy keen idea to do wonderful things for the natives. And I mean, the principle. I don't want to be too cynical here, okay?
No, the thing about it is he comes in with hobnail boots on this. I mean, because the whole grid in Molokai isn't anywhere near 17 megawatts. It's a fraction of that.
That's right. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the peak output of the MECO, the one single MECO power plant there, is, I believe, around 7 megawatts. So this is certainly substantially oversized. Well, then keep in mind, the law of physics says that if you're going to pump water from one level to a higher level, and you're going to then capture some of the energy, kinetic energy of that water as it's coming back down to where you pumped it from to begin with, then the law of physics says that there's going to be an energy loss in doing that. I don't know how ultimately efficient it's going to be, but that you have to. You're not going to get as much power from the falling hydro as you used to get it up there in the first place.
It's so interesting. It's almost ironic that the island which was most resistant to wind, I mean, really resistant to wind, violently resistant to wind, is now pushing ahead on these things, these devices and installations that will turn everything over and make it a completely renewable grid, completely, and
well,
then make diesel unnecessary.
It's far from a done deal as to whether the locals there are buying into to Princeton Energy Group's proposal. I think I saw a quote by one of the leaders there of the renewable energy community there, who said, "Well, this sounds kind of interesting, but to us it's just as important, if not more so, that individual homeowners and business owners can put PV on their home if they choose, rather than have again, some mainland company put in a nice big solar array because they think it's a great idea, while the rest of us still can't put in a 3 kW system on our house because NECO says no can.
Yeah. Well, but you can see the outlines of the future in all of this, can't you? I mean, the outlines of the future will include at least in substantial part, new PV, new connectivity with the grid, new storage with the grid, a lot of smart devices, which we don't know all of them just yet, and new interconnect rules and practices. And that's the way it seems to be going, I think. And the question is whether anything remarkable is going to, aside from this Molokai possibility, anything remarkable is going to happen in the 2014 legislature that might recognize these new outlines and deal with them. We were talking before we began about the comments made by Senator Mike Gabbard at the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum legislative briefing on January 10th, and I wonder if you could review that with us and try to figure out what he and the Senate Energy Committee is going to do.
Sure, but it's probably useful to just go back to last session, the 2013 session, and note that there was really a big full court press on the part of many stakeholders to try to get a new solar tax credit bill to Governor Abercrombie's desk. And this was at least partially in response to some rule changes that the Department of Taxation put into effect in late 2012. So it looked quite promising in the first few days of May as the conference committees were going through doing their thing and going through the bills left standing at the end of the session, and the particular conference committee for a bill that would have made some substantial alterations to the existing solar tax credit was not passed out of the conference committee, and therefore the status quo of the then temporary rule changes from Department of Taxation were kept in effect. And then just
and these rule
recently,
changes do not favor installers, do they? I mean, it makes it harder for an installer to spread a given installation or around a larger roof. Is that right?
No, I would say I'd put a bit of a different spin on that, Jay, and say that essentially the rule changes made it more difficult for a homeowner to claim 2, 3, 4, 5 or more individual tax credits.
No, that's
so
better.
To me, the rule change was very much overdue because there had been, in my opinion, not a small amount of abuse on the part of both contractors, homeowners, and their tax people, essentially going far, far beyond the letter and intent of the tax credit.
So they would do multiple installations, or at least try to characterize it as multiple installations, and try to get multiple credits that way. And this rule change, and notably from the tax office, says no, you can't do that.
Well, it's not so much no, you can't do it, period, but they put greater restrictions on it that the renewable energy, the solar energy industry initially was rather unhappy about. Therefore, that's why they had this big push in the legislature to try to change it last session and to essentially overwrite what DOTAX came up with. But from what I understand now, and I guess this should not surprise me as a political scientist, but from what I understand now, there may be substantially less appetite on the part of both legislators, such as Senator Gabbard, as well as the Solar Industry Association folks, to go at it again this session after not being able to be successful last year. So it sounds like there's a greater, what's the word to use, maybe sense of fatalism that the fact that DOTAX made permanent these so-called temporary changes just last month, if memory serves, that there's no strong desire to give it another shot this current session. I think one wild card could very well be when DOTAX does announce what the tax credit hit will be from year 2012, tax year calendar year 2012, which could come any day now or could come in the weeks or hopefully the months to come, which will show that the state general fund took a much larger hit in terms of the total number of dollars from tax year 2012, people claiming solar tax credits compared to the previous year, 2011. Just to give an idea of scope, 2011 came in at about $70 million, and I think it's entirely possible that 2012 could be somewhere in the 150 to 200 million dollar range. So,
that's a lot.
Will
of
that
bread.
make a difference?
Those numbers are bigger than Act 221 ever provided. Interesting.
So, yes, and I guess remains to be seen to what extent this will get people's attention, or will be another ho-hum kind of moment saying, "Yeah, we expected that. What's the big deal?" So, it's you observe the
take this one step further and say 2014. What does it look like, you think, in the legislature for any relief on tax credits? To extend them or make a soft landing for them, or otherwise bring them in line as against their current expiration date, their current sunset. Is there any chance of that at all, or is that also a dead duck?
Well, when you have got, I mean, the legislative game goes as follows. You think of the legislature as well. For example, in the Hawaii House, there are 51 members, and in the Hawaii Senate, there are 25 members. And that's where laws are made, and laws get debated, and they get passed from this committee to the next, and they get, a small number of them that started at the beginning will actually get to the governor's desk when all is said and done. But the real power in legislatures and in our own Congress in Washington and in the legislature in Hawaii is held in the hands of committee chairmen and committee chairwomen. And an energy issue such as tax credits would be dealt with by the money committees, the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee in the House and Senate, and by the respective Energy or Environment Committees. And if you don't have buy-in from the chairs of the energy committees, which is Senator Mike Gabbard, a real good guy on Oahu, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Energy and Environment Committee chair on the House side is Chris Lee.
Yes, that's true.
You have to have those two individuals who believe that it is, in fact, a good and necessary thing to consider and try to move a bill that would modify and change the current state solar tax credit as it's been reformulated and redefined by Department of Taxation. If you don't have the buy-in of Mr. Gabbard and Lee, then it's hard to imagine any effort to change the tax credits going anywhere, because that's the nature of our political system. You got to get the buy-in from the chairs, otherwise it's not going anywhere. Let
me offer this thought, though, and this came up in comments that were made by Representative Sylvia Luke in that briefing. What she said, and I think it goes throughout all these issues, is I, Sylvia Luke, don't really see a need for changing the barrel tax right now. We have other fish to fry. We're not excited about that. But if you guys get together and you form a group and send me a lot of mail and come and testify in my committee, then maybe we would consider it. And I think that goes for all of them, that whatever their inclinations, if the energy industry could get together and be on the same path, the same point, the same message, and show a strong, stakeholder statement of where it should go, that would be very persuasive to them. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the last session, they didn't have that. There were too many people advancing too many alternative possibilities. The crowd was not together, and so it lost momentum. It was kind of a conceptual mess because people didn't agree on stuff. But if they do agree, then you can. It's possible to convince these chairs to do something they might not be inclined to do at the outset. And
well, I think I would respectfully put up a different spin on that, Jay. And my impression is that in reading so much of the testimony that the revised or the attempts to revise the floor tax credit bills received last session, so much of that testimony was highly choreographed and coordinated, because you looked at the testimony and page after page from different group or different company, and they were using the same phrases, the same paragraphs, almost verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a very tightly choreographed effort to try to move this revised tax credit forward. And from what I understand, it was the money chairs of that conference committee, which is Sylvia Luke, like you said, on the House, and then was David Ige, who's challenging Abercrombie for the Democratic nomination, to Senator David Ige, who is the Ways and Means chair on the Senate side, that it was one or both of those two money chairs that essentially put the kibosh on that conference committee last year, passing that bill out of conference. So,
no, I agree. When it comes to the money chairs, the burden is much higher because they are dealing with external considerations. How much is the budget? Can we really afford this? It's a priorities question. And so if they have obligations in other areas, no matter what you say, they may not be able to hear you. That's Marco Mangelsdorf. Let me take a break, Marco, with Provision Solar and Hilo. This is Think Tech Talks, talking about the state of clean energy. What can we expect for solar in 2014? We'll be right back after this short break.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
We're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell. We're here on Think Tech Talks, talking about the state of clean energy. What can we expect in solar in 2014 with Marco Mangelsdorf for Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii. He joins us by phone, and we are at our studio, of course, downtown in Pioneer Plaza, the core of downtown. And as we left, as I interrupted you, Marco, you were talking about how this was going to work in this session as far as the tax credit is concerned. Would you continue, please?
Sure. I was just going to note that right now, the way the solar tax credit stands, there is no sunset date, which means there's no date when the tax credit is going to go away, which is in contrast to the current federal investment tax credit for solar, which has, it's actually not a sunset date, but on January 1, 2017, the federal tax credit for solar, whether it's for a residential application or commercial or industrial application, will go down, is scheduled to go down from the current 30% to the original 10%, what it was before it was increased to 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that as of January 1, it will drop to 10%, whereas the state tax credit for solar has no sunset date. So given the fact that the tax credit is still quite in my opinion, juicy and lucrative for both the homeowners and business owners to go PV, that there is some risk that if the industry, the PV industry and the various trade groups decide to really push for a revised state tax credit, that the end result at the end of the session and in the conference committee may not be perceived as being as beneficial as the current law, as the current regulation. So there is a bit of a gamble that what's left standing at the end of the committee, especially depending on the news that comes in the weeks and months to come that will affect the views and opinions of legislators, there's the risk that there would be some political momentum to putting a sunset date on the tax credit and also ramping it down over time.
Yeah, so it's hard to make a prediction then about how solar installations will do in 2014, but that doesn't mean we can't ask you for one anyway. What do you think's going to happen? All that considered.
As far as
you've identified a 20% drop last year. What's going to happen this year?
It's hard to imagine that there is going to be an increase. Because if you were to argue, well, I think, for example, I think there will be an increase. Well, what would be the reasons to argue for an increase? Can we say it's because the tax credits are going to get better? Highly unlikely. Can we say it's because that HECO, HELCO, MECO, and KIUC are going to find some type of means that has eluded them to date that will allow them to announce with great fanfare next week or next month that they can increase by 50% or more what they currently have accepted into the grid? I think that's relatively, if not highly, unlikely. So if
you mean highly, it's not highly likely.
It's highly unlikely that they're going to find some type of fix or method or means that allow them to go dramatically higher from one day or 1 week or 1 month to the next.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of more and more PV systems hooking up to the grid is going to be a more incremental process, that they'll find ways to tweak out a bit more as far as being able to accept more. So I still just have a hard time getting around the grid saturation issue as the principal stumbling block for dramatically increasing the amount of PV systems that are sold and the amount of PV capacity that went in. So I guess my prognostication would be that 2014 in terms of overall numbers of permitted systems is likely to be at or around or a bit less than 2013.
Let me ask you one more thing. We only have 3 or 4 minutes left, but I'm driven to ask you this. You know, we put so much attention on PV. And indeed, PV has been the most rapidly expanding renewable in the state, percentage-wise, with all those installations. And still a lot of people want to have it, whatever the barriers may be, they still want to have it. And if they're given a chance, they'll take it. But, you know, it seems like there's too much attention almost on PV, and you mentioned before the independent island grid. I like to call that IGGY. You know, and we seem to be going in the direction, the model of having PV everywhere on every island and every island independent, which, you know, that's troublesome on a sort of statewide consolidation basis, a statewide cooperation basis, especially you know, in view of all the talk about the wind and the undersea cable a year or two ago. But you know, I've heard stories and thoughts lately about trying to have redundancy on PV. In other words, if you make an island all PV and you go down this path of having PV storage, pumped hydro, whatever it is, and make the island work only on PV and not connected, you're not having redundancy. If that system goes bad for any reason, you're stuck. And I wonder what your thoughts are here in the last couple of minutes, Marco, about the need to have the inter-island cable as a redundant system so that at the end of the day we can all feel comfortable that our clean energy will get to us, that one way or the other we will always be supplied, and we won't have some crazy, unpredicted, unanticipated problem bring down the one system that we seem focused on. What do you think?
Well, to use an overused metaphor, I mean, putting all our eggs in one basket does not make sense, and I don't think is a very wise direction to go, and I certainly don't advocate it. So having a multiplicity of sources and continuing to rely on combustion turbines that are going to be using some type of fuel source, whether it's wood chips here on this island or fuel coming in from Southeast Asia or H power using garbage. I think that's going to be a part of the mix for a very long time to come in terms of intra-island cables. And if I'm not mistaken, the one that's still on the table right now would just be going between Maui and Oahu,
Yes.
and essentially bypassing the cranky people on Molokai who don't want any part of their proposed wind farm, and also maybe giving up on David Murdoch's dream of a couple hundred megawatts on the windy side of Lanai. So
Yeah.
does it make all that much sense to just hook up two islands, or is that just seen as the preliminary interconnection between two major islands and then deal with the wind stuff as it comes along?
Well, at the very least, it's something we have to keep our eye on. At the very least, it seems to me that, as you say, right now it's only two islands connected, but maybe that could be expanded if it works. Maybe that could be made into more than two islands. I think it's a matter of sort of conceptualizing where this is going and what we ultimately see, with benefit of what we've learned over the past 6 years. About how it works best. We're still in the design phase of trying to design a statewide system.
Right.
What a wonderful historical time to be alive. So what do you think? Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I was just, we're about out of time, and I was going to pose my question for what is the next event that is worth talking about, you and me, and I guess it's to get those numbers about how well the installations have done. Is that the way you see it? When are we going to have our next conversation, and what is the news story that will be of issue?
Two possible news stories. Well, I don't think they're going to be possible. I know they're going to be news stories. One is when the numbers for 2013 actual installed PV capacity comes out, which, as I mentioned earlier, could come from HECO to file to the PUC any day now. I think that's going to get a fair amount of press. And the second shoe to drop will be when the Department of Taxation releases their numbers for what the tax credit hit was for tax year, calendar year 2012.
Okay, well, we got plenty to talk about, and probably soon, Marco. So let's plan to have another conversation in the next few weeks.
I would very much appreciate that, and always look forward to speaking with you, Jay.
Same, Marco. That's Marco Mangelsdorf, Provision Solar in Hilo, Hawaii. You're on Think Tech Talks, Hawaii, the state of clean energy. What can we expect in solar in 2014? An ongoing story, evolving every day. Thank you so much, Marco.
Thank you very much, Jay. Bye-bye.
Aloha.